On a Friday in July, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi came to Indianapolis. Her time in town was eye-opening, revealing how liberals and conservatives go about business in much the same way. Her first event was part of her Speaker in the House series, and the second was to speak at a Young Democrats of America convention, or YDA. Pelosi is traveling the nation in an attempt to fortify the Democratic base for the 2020 elections. At the first event, Pelosi spoke in a town hall-styled setting alongside Representative Andre Carson. They answered a few questions from the audience and touted their $15 an hour bill recently passed in the House. When she spoke to YDA, it was more of a rally. The Young Dems were loud, elated, and chanting Nancy over and over. They vigorously applauded her every line, from fighting for the middle class to fighting to protect elections from foreign intervention. Nancy must have been happy with all the cheering because, after all, it's her job to get the people riled up to vote liberal.
She has the power of the purse, and she also has the power of the vote. And for her to take the time to come to Indiana to speak to the Young Democrats Convention, to do a town hall here, I think it shows that they understand that Indiana is a critical state in the 2020 election.
We got a chance to speak to some of these people. We can tell that there is a lot of excitement and hope for 2020. There's especially excitement for Elizabeth Warren. Her name came up with everyone we spoke to at YDA.
Politically or policy-wise, I like Elizabeth Warren.
I like with Elizabeth Warren.
While the excitement is real, the understanding of complexity of politics seemed to be lacking. This was made clear at the YDA convention. This is where we came to understand that liberals can be just as bad as conservatives when it comes to bolstering their ideas. The Nancy chants and Pledge Allegiance aside, let's take a look at some examples. In the June Democratic debates, Bernie Sanders was asked whether an expansion of Medicare would mean higher taxes for the middle class.
And if so, how do you sell that to voters?
After significant prodding, the candidate eventually agreed to this premise, with a few qualifications, of course. So, we put it to progressives, whether they would be open to higher taxes on the middle class. What we found was that rather than conceding that a slightly higher income tax may be necessary to offset lowered health care, they think the money should come from somewhere else entirely.
So I have to kind of disagree with that entire notion, honestly. I think we spend so much money, so much unnecessary money on our military and on building these unneeded giant planes.
Yes, the US military spends a lot of money, and we should better allocate those resources. But simply saying that is not an exact solution. It's merely shifting the focus. He's answering the question with a new question, a classic case of whataboutism. But since we are talking about military spending, it's true that a number of young progressives feel that a smaller portion of their tax dollars should go to defense spending. But they also fail to understand that a cut to military spending would have major repercussions that would be frightening to many Americans. Cutting the military's budget has huge implications. What does it mean for benefits to service members and their families? We would love to cut costs, but what would a smaller military mean for our presence in the world? Most of our foreign troops aren't even engaged in an active war. It may be reasonable to want to reduce military expenditure, but let's not think moving billions of dollars from defense to another department won't have major ramifications for the country and the world. Another way progressives would like to obtain funding for social programs is through the increased regulation and taxation of so-called big banks.
The middle class has suffered long enough, and I think it's time for the top 1%, especially people like big banks. I think it's time for them to pay their due.
This idea is popular among young liberals because they see the big banks as the root cause for the 2008 recession, the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. And yet, the financial institutions were bailed out and allowed to continue profiting, even as working-class Americans continue to suffer from the impacts of the recession. However popular the idea may be, liberals seem disinclined to discuss the particular measures that should be taken. There are a wide variety of ways to regulate big banks, from limiting the amount of risk they are allowed to take on, to taxing them based on riskiness of their investments. And even deciding on one of those regulatory solutions doesn't help us determine what we should consider big banks. It's probably too much to expect liberals to be completely aligned, not only on what they want to get done, but also how to go about it. Even so, if liberals spent less time talking about whether big banks should be broken up or not, and more time debating solutions for how these banks should be regulated, the moderate tone of the solutions would be more likely to attract left-leaning centrists, as well as independents and conservatives even, who agree that something must be done to avoid another catastrophic recession in the near future. The House legislation that passed in late July plans to increase the minimum wage from the current $7.25 to $15 an hour over the next 6 years. Progressive voters are such fans of the measure that the $15 an hour minimum wage has become part of the Democratic Party platform. Though enthusiastic, these voters also appear to have little understanding for the specific economic repercussions of such a plan.
So if an economist was to say, hey, look, it's a good idea, but not right now, I'm all for that, for not pushing it to 15. But if an economist would say, hey, look, we should be pushing this, I'm all for it. Absolutely.
A higher wage in part makes sense because the minimum wage has been stuck at $7.25 an hour since 2009, while inflation has kept at about 2% annually. With this in mind, it's sensible to demand a living wage. But let's see what that means by comparing two states with very different cost of living, California and Indiana. Compared to the average power of the dollar across the US, in California, the power of a dollar is about 88 cents. This, of course, is due to the higher cost of living. Whereas in Indiana, where the cost of living is relatively lower, a dollar is worth $1.10. Then there's the matter of scaling the pay. According to Axios, in El Centro, California, nursing assistants make roughly $15 an hour. A federal increase would mean they would make as much as low-skilled workers like fast food employees. Yes, fast food employees deserve a livable wage. But nursing assistants need to also be properly compensated for larger investment they have had to make towards their education, which usually entails a greater amount of student loan debt. Their wages need to be higher or proportional to the investment in time and money they have put into their professions. Returning to Indiana, one of the only employers providing $15 an hour minimum wage has had to adapt to the increased cost of labor. When Amazon raised its minimum wage to $15 an hour, they had to adjust the salaries for senior workers who were already making that much, so they bumped their hourly wages by $1. However, workers have complained that Amazon has stopped issuing as many bonuses and stock options, and has even cut back on hours, resulting in an overall loss of income. One reason that Amazon can afford to cut back on hours is due to the rapid pace of advancements in automation. A blanketed $15 an hour just might accelerate this advancement in order to offset the higher cost of low-skilled workers. Companies will have to decide between paying more for the same amount of labor or cutting labor costs in favor of more research into automated solutions. Pelosi coming to town was eye-opening as we got the opportunity to see how liberals can sometimes fail to understand the nuances of their ideas. Whether it's decreasing military spending, increasing regulatory pressure on big banks, or raising the income of low-skilled workers, it seems liberals want to fundamentally change how the US economy works, so as to remove some income disparity and raise up the middle class. But they don't seem all that concerned with how radical their message sounds to conservatives, and those who fall somewhere in the middle of the political spectrum. They push radical and expensive ideas without necessarily reflecting on the negative externalities those would cause.